You're listening to episode 107 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. David Treleaven returns to the podcast to speak about his new book, Trauma-Sensitive Mindfulness, Practices for Safe and Transformative Healing. As mindfulness goes mainstream, more and more people are giving it a try. At an introduction to mindfulness program I gave just last week, when I asked the question, how many of you have tried meditation of some kind, everyone's hand went up. 5 years ago, that wasn't the case. Along with the proliferation of mindfulness programs comes an appropriate awareness that mindful meditation practices are not a cure-all and not necessarily well-timed for all participants. While there can be benefits, it's important for teachers to learn about the nuances of trauma-sensitive mindfulness and ways they might engage with those suffering from trauma, and perhaps when such interventions may not be as helpful. David Treleaven, PhD, is an educator and trauma professional whose work focuses on the intersection of trauma, mindfulness, and social justice. Trained in counseling psychology at the University of British Columbia, he received his doctorate in psychology from the California Institute of Integral Studies. He's been studying mindfulness for 20 years and has a private practice in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'd also like to note to those who are listening to the podcast, there is a link to an upcoming program about mindfulness and trauma in April. Please be sure to check that out. Our guest today returning to the podcast is David Treleaven. David, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Ted. Happy to be here with you.
So good to see you again. And for those who are listening, David was with us before in episode 25, which at this point is about 3 years ago. And we had the wonderful opportunity to meet face-to-face at the Wisdom 2.0 conference last week. So it's such a joy to be able to spend this time with you, David.
It's great. I remember doing that interview with you, and I remember thinking that the book that I was writing would be done in probably 9 months. And I sit here deeply humbled on the other side of that. It took a lot longer, but that interview was really helpful. So it's great to circle back with you.
Good. Glad to hear it. And glad that we're finally getting to talk about the new book. So we're going to skip past the usual questions about your background. I'll be linking that episode on this episode page. So for those who are listening, you'll be able to find it there pretty easily. Let's talk about this new book. I'm noticing some very encouraging things about it that may be unexpected for some readers. First, and I think critically, you echo what so many of us in mindfulness have been saying for quite some time, is that mindfulness meditation is not a cure-all. It may not even be well-timed for people experiencing particular sufferings, like those stemming from trauma. I'm wondering if you could talk about that, maybe from your own challenges with meditation.
Yeah, happy to. And, happy to engage with you around this and also your audience from my sense of the folks that are really tuning into your podcast, interested in practice, how that's intersecting with science, and this piece that mindfulness and mindfulness meditation isn't just a panacea. And that's really one of the major things I'm up to with this book, is to be part of a larger conversation of folks of which you've been involved. This article around Mind the Hype of saying, let's tap, what's it called? Pump the brakes. Let's pump the brakes for a second and really look at how are we defining mindfulness? What are some potential drawbacks? And that we're doing this not as a blanket just critique of mindfulness and mindfulness practices, but to say, actually, if we're in this conversation, we will be stronger for it. Like the people that are being served by mindfulness interventions will just know more. So it's not, I want to say right from the get that I'm most interested in a nuanced and increasingly complex conversation about how we're offering mindfulness instruction and interventions. And my lens is particularly around trauma. Mm-hmm. I'm interested in what is the intersection of trauma and mindfulness. What would teachers and practitioners offering basic mindfulness instructions need to know in order to be offering mindfulness in a safe way for trauma survivors? And really to try to, I don't know if it's poke at the bear, but pop the bubble of mindfulness being this panacea and really just try to get more complex around it.
I'm wondering if you might share, there's something you share in the beginning of the book. It's in the introduction, actually. You talk a bit about your own experiences on retreat. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share that here for the listeners.
I'd be happy to, yeah. So I was after maybe 5 or 6 years of practice, was taking meditation practice more seriously and had a daily practice and was on a longer term retreat and had the experience of almost like a circuit breaker going off in my body. I really just, something blew out inside of me. And for the next half day, really had trouble feeling my body, feeling my feet. I really checked out. Something felt off. And I went to the teachers on the retreat who I really respect. And typically what they suggested was to follow basic instructions. Just keep, go back to the cushion, keep being in, be gentle, do some metta practice, some loving kindness. And I did that, but I found that actually by the end of the retreat, I was feeling worse than I did when I started the retreat. And I got home and people looked at me and they said, you actually seem like you're worse off than when you went on the retreat, and what's up? And so this opened an inquiry for me, and it's a longer story that I share in the introduction. But it landed me at the intersection of mindfulness and traumatic stress. I had some experiences which were producing trauma symptoms, and that they were showing up on retreat. So I started into this inquiry of what was happening to me on the retreat, how did this intersect with trauma, and how did the two go together? And ended up doing a dissertation on the topic and a doctoral degree. My dissertation defense got filmed in this really rickety camera, this terrible, if folks see it's terrible, the quality of it. But anyway, it went sort of viral. And I'm putting that in air quotes as much as a viral video could happen in mindfulness community. But I ended up being a bit of a lightning rod. I started gathering stories. People started coming to me and saying, wow, I've had similar experiences. Can I talk to you about it? So over a number of years, I learned that there were people in contemplative environments who had a history of trauma, who were actually falling through the cracks. And they weren't getting the kind of care that I think probably the teachers at the time would want them to have. So that was how I came to this topic. And at some point just said, well, I believe that mindfulness teachers want the best for their students. What would they need to know in order to offer trauma-informed practice? And the last thing I'll say, the guiding question of the whole project is, how do we both leverage the potential benefits of mindfulness for survivors, but while at the same time acknowledging and working skillfully with the potential pitfalls that can come up of folks that are in contemplative practice?
Yeah, and I'm glad you raised that, because one of the other aspects to this that I want to make sure the listeners grasp is that this is not a condemnation of mindfulness programs, that you're quite clear that despite the challenges, mindfulness practices can be helpful to those suffering from trauma if done, as you said, with care and attention to the uniqueness of their experiences.
That's the basic argument and punchline of the whole book, is that I believe mindfulness instruction, mindfulness interventions are more powerful when the people offering them have a basic understanding of trauma. And that can mean a couple different things: being able to recognize trauma symptoms, respond to them effectively, and at the end of the day, prevent re-traumatization. But in no way do I want your listeners to think that I'm fear mongering. It really, really, I'm not. And I think sometimes magazines can take research, again, as came up in the Mind the Hype article, where they'll just suddenly have this headline that says, "Oh, mindfulness and meditation is bad. It's a bad thing. No one should do it." And I want to say from my seat, most people who've experienced trauma that end up in a meditation class or an MBSR course, I think they have very positive experiences, generally speaking. And then there's some folks who will have potentially dysregulating experiences, and we want to be skillful at that. And because your podcast is grounded in science, I want to say there is not a lot of empirical research here. So we're here in a framework that's theoretical at this place, but I want to be encouraging folks to be doing more research around, well, what is the intersection of trauma and mindfulness? And we can talk more about, the research coming out of Brown and the Varieties of Contemplative Experience project, where I think that's starting to come to fruition.
I'm glad you brought that up. Let's talk for a moment about your forward author, Willoughby Britton, and her work at Brown. Would you care to describe just a little bit of that?
Happy to. Will folks know about Willoughby? Or
yeah, there'll be a little bit of, for folks who are listening, we'll have some familiarity with Willoughby, and we will be bringing her onto the podcast at some point. So we will be bringing her on.
Well, I look forward to that episode. I will listen to it. Willoughby Britton has been doing cutting edge neuroscience and clinical psychology research around mindfulness for 20 years now, has a lab at Brown University specifically devoted to studying mindfulness. And for the most part, she was studying the benefits of mindfulness around stress reduction and health. And then at some point pivoted and said, let's also look at potentially challenging experiences that people are having. Willoughby she is an incredible scholar, a great person. And she sought me out. She actually saw that dissertation defense video. She gave me a call and she said, let's talk. And Willoughby, over a number of years with a number of other researchers, has been doing work around a project called the Varieties of Contemplative Experience project. And maybe, Ted, you'd be willing to link this in the show notes, because for folks that are interested, this is a really groundbreaking study that was just published about 5 months ago at this point. And they were doing select qualitative interviews with a number of practitioners, people who were really steeped in mindfulness, to talk about challenging experiences. So Willoughby had shifted her attention to say, let's also make sure that we're looking at potentially challenging experiences people are having. And if folks are interested, you might want to link this. Willoughby did an amazing presentation at Mind and Life to the Dalai Lama. And to see her in front of the Dalai Lama bringing this to him inside of her research is a really fascinating conversation. So she wrote the foreword. And the last thing I'll say here with Willoughby is she's been someone who's really opening this conversation empirically around certain difficulties with mindfulness interventions. And then I'm coming in as a trauma-trained practitioner to say, here are some grounded suggestions of what folks can actually do. So it's a bit of a 1-2 punch. Like, hey, folks, mindfulness isn't just a panacea. And then here, let's follow up with, here's some grounded practical suggestions of what you can actually do.
So something else, speaking of Willoughby, there's an event coming up that I also want to make sure that the listeners are aware of. So we'll be publishing this podcast in time to be able to attend. That there is an event coming up called First Do No Harm, Foundational Competencies for Working Skillfully with Meditation-Related Challenges. It will be you, Willoughby, Jared Lindahl, April 6th through April 8th in 2018 at the Center for Mindfulness. I'm going to be linking to the webpage that talks about that on this episode page. But David, I'm wondering if you might just say a little bit about how that came about and who that's for and what it's about.
Yeah, would love to. Folks, listeners are welcome to even email me about it if they're interested, really want to engage and get folks out. But it's really the intersection of what you and I were just talking about, is to say Willoughby is going to be there with Jared Lindahl, someone who works with her on a number of papers, is in that Brown lab, is also an awesome scholar, Buddhist scholar. And we're going to be there to really try to provide folks who are working inside of mindfulness communities or contemplative settings to both talk about the research and to talk about here are some of the practical suggestions specifically around trauma. We'll be focused around trauma, especially on the second day of the training. But also there's going to be intake forms. Willoughby has a meditation safety toolkit. Really, we want to empower folks to say, let's just add this to your toolkit and really get into some case studies and dive in. And so we're really excited to do it live. And how this came about was, I think it was about 6 months ago, we said, it's time. It's really time. We wanted to wait until it's all perfect, but at some point now we have publications out. Let's just dive into it and let's go live with folks in community and really engage. So I'd be really fired up to have folks come there.
Great. And I know the center certainly is very excited about it and eager to have this conversation because there's, as you've said and represent very well in the book, is that mindfulness can be a wonderful tool. And sometimes the timing or appropriateness of that needs to take into consideration the nuance of the individual's place and where they are and what's happening in their lives right now. So you're also very candid in the book about how important it is to change the conditions which may foster trauma arising in the first place. Now, this is in part informed by your social activism, your interest in this, and is, when I was first reading that, is a bit of a contradiction, a good contradiction, I think, to what the accusers, the McMindfulness crowd, say, that mindfulness-based programs are specifically intended to, finger quotes here, pacify people and make them accept conditions they're in. And I'm wondering how you might respond to that.
That's a great question. That's a big one. So we can dive in as deep as you want here. And this is often a surprise to readers where, and I want to say this from the start, that I'm one of the main arguments I'm making in the book is that trauma-informed mindfulness or trauma-informed practice involves resourcing social justice movements that are actively trying to shift conditions that perpetuate trauma. And I want to say this as a student of psychology who came up really being trained to think about trauma as an individual tragedy. That's really how I was trained to think about it. It's a bad thing that happens to people. It's actually the worst thing that can happen to people. And the deeper that I got into the study of trauma, I realized that any conversation about traumatic stress is necessarily a political one. And I don't necessarily have a huge agenda. I just want your listeners to know that I'm not going to harp or I'm not going to get on a soapbox here. But I just want to keep complexifying what we mean by trauma, that it's not just an accident or thing that happened. This is always happening inside a social context. So even traumatic accidents that happen at work happen inside of a social context where it's often poor people who are needing to take on more dangerous work. So we're always in this social context. And from everything I've learned, I thought there was a strong argument to be made to really be resourcing the folks who are on the front lines trying to actually shift the conditions that can perpetuate trauma. Now, to your second point on the McMindfulness, I think this is it's a fantastic question. And I actually don't have the answer. But to your point about the critique, yes, McMindfulness folks would say, you're just assuaging, you're putting everyone to sleep. My take on the intersection of mindfulness and trauma is actually to say, hey, people who have been practicing mindfulness, you have been cultivating the skill of being uncomfortable. That is fantastic. And if you're going to engage in any conversations around social justice, that will be necessarily uncomfortable, especially if you have privilege. And I'm saying this as someone who's white, I'm straight, cisgendered male. And so, sure, I could use mindfulness to go to sleep and bypass and just check out. But I think the practice at the end of the day is actually about waking up, and that leads us towards actually creating social change. Again, this is a huge conversation, but I think at its absolute best, mindfulness and trauma is about being able to be in uncomfortable conversations around race, around sexual trauma and sexual violence. So, Me Too, the Black Lives Matter movement, that is all so related to trauma. And I wanted that to be a part of the book.
Absolutely. And I couldn't I think you said that very eloquently, that of course this is a very big topic, and the practice of being aware of what's happening around us, not turning away from it, sitting with discomfort, with things not going as we want, is part and parcel of the practice. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. Can I jump in with a story about this? I think it might lead us to a different spot too. I'm really interested in this piece around spiritual bypassing. And I don't know if that's come up, if that's a new term. There's a book written by Robert Augustus Masters. It's a term originally coined by John Welwood to say, where are people using spiritual or contemplative practices to avoid certain feelings or unresolved wounds or developmental needs? And I just met someone, so I want to tell this story to listeners. I met someone, they wrote me and they said, hey, can I get on the phone with you and tell you about my story? And they had some unresolved trauma from when they were in their 20s, and they were going on contemplative retreats. They're going on mindfulness retreats. And they were really good at dissociating. Dissociating was sort of a survival strategy for them. And again, we can talk about the physiological reasons that dissociation happens, but basically they were really good at checking out. And they were going on meditation retreats, and the teachers were saying, they would pull him aside and they would say, you have such a powerful practice. You're such a good meditator. And so inside the context of this particular contemplative setting, this person was actually getting props for the fact that they could leave their body. And he said, you know what? If 10 years ago someone had told me, you're actually leaving your body, you need some help to get back in it, I can help you with that, he would have done it. But he kept going back to the practice, hoping that he would shift. So I think that's some of the terrain that we're in here, is when are we using practice to skip over something, which can relate to social justice, and when are we using it actually to bypass and get away from something that's uncomfortable that requires our attention?
Yeah, I think there's an important, again, a wonderful complexity to this, because I don't find this to be a bad thing. I think it's a good thing that we can take a close look at the proliferation of scenarios we've got. Having a way to step aside from overwhelm may be appropriate. And in fact, let's segue into this. Is a question we were going to talk a little bit earlier. Is in one example in the book, you mention, and for those of you who are following along at home, this is on page 120, you talk about stabilizing anchors of attention. And this stood out for me in particular because of the use of the term home base, which I've been doing in my own MBSR teaching. I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that and how it relates to what we've just been talking about.
Mm-hmm. Happy to. I love that you use home base too in your teaching and your instruction. And well, as a lot of listeners who've done any kind of meditation will know, we tend to have an anchor that we utilize at first to provide us some mental stability. And in Vipassana practice, or at least the traditions that I came up in, it was often utilizing the breath. And that could be the sensations of the breath at the nostrils or the belly. And this was often talked about as a neutral anchor of attention, a place that we can come back to when our mind inevitably wanders, which it will. Now, what's interesting here is that for trauma survivors, folks who are experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress, the breath is often not neutral. It's often a place, for many reasons that have to do with our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, is that the breath is actually tagged with somatic reminders of an older trauma. And that could be hyperventilating. Basically, when one pays attention to the breath, it can become quite stirring. Now, sometimes it can be regulating, but other times it can actually exacerbate trauma symptoms. So if we just take that as a starting point, that the breath isn't necessarily neutral for trauma survivors, we as practitioners want to be able to give folks different home bases that we can work with. And I want to give props here to a teacher named Michelle McDonald. Michelle McDonald was one of the earliest insight teachers who was working around the intersection of trauma and mindfulness meditation. And on a retreat with Michelle, she said, you know what? If hearing actually works better for you, go ahead and do that. There's no strict rules we need to follow here. What we're trying to do is help stabilize your attention. And so without wanting
It's not about the breath. It's not the magic of the breath or the magic of the body. It's about how we work with attention and what is the best way to do that for this person.
So well said. So well said. And I think can become enamored with the breath, that will be the magic gateway instead of what you just said. Like, no, pull back. Actually, we're working with attention here. So I couldn't agree more. So these are some of we can talk about this. That's partly how the book is structured, is wanting to give people some practical suggestions of, oh, you mean I could use a different home base or a different anchor of attention, again, in service of someone's life. We want, at the end of the day, the argument I want to make is we just want practice to be moving towards less suffering. And so that's, again, with the anchor of attention, it's not being too rigid about it, but learning that there's space and there's room.
Thank you so much for that deep dive on just one of the topics that you have in this. So let's talk a little bit about the book itself. It's in 2 parts. Tell us about each of those and what's in them.
I'll tell a quick story, which is when I started to talk to a couple different publishers about the book, I went to them and they said, they were very kind. They got back to me and said, well, to be honest, all you have right now is a critique. And that's not super compelling for readers. And so at that point, that was 4 years ago now, and said, you're really going to have to offer folks, well, what do I do? And what would be some ways to work with this? So that's what kicked off all these conversations and interviews and research about, well, what is trauma-sensitive practice? How could you actually do it? So the book's structured in 2 parts. The first is theory and the second is practice. And I try to build a cohesive argument on the first half, taking a deep dive into trauma, taking a deep dive into mindfulness and research around trauma, looking at the history, looking at the neuroscience. I want to build a foundation of understanding that we can work on. And then the second half contains 5 principles of trauma-sensitive practice. And I say this in the introduction. I am definitely not coming to this conversation trying to be the expert. I'm not trying to be the guy who has all the answers. I actually just want to be in the conversation with the mindfulness community to say, hey, what would we need to know? And let's just try to do the best we can for the people that we work with. So the second half has about 36 modifications spread out that I'm trying to make really practical. And that can be, how do you recognize symptoms of trauma? What does the environment look like? How do you want to work with relationship? How do you work with the body? All these different things that I learned we need to pull back and focus on. So that's the interplay throughout, kind of a praxis, just trying to look at the combination of theory and practice for trauma-sensitive mindfulness.
And you're also very clear in the book that this is not here's the be-all, end-all list of answers. That this is a conversation and an ongoing learning of how we work with trauma.
I'm so glad you said that. And yes, I feel like we could have a deep conversation about that, but I'll say it very briefly. I really want listeners to know, and readers, that in my experience, trauma-informed practice is not a checklist. It's not something that you can just say. I mean, there are checklists that we can go through in terms of an intake form and
Right.
But it's a path, and it's a humbling one, especially related to the political conversation we were having about 10 minutes ago, is if you're going to commit to really looking at trauma, my argument is that will be an ongoing path for one's whole life and practice to keep looking at how is trauma being perpetuated and how is it being experienced, and who, most importantly, who is being targeted by systems of oppression and who is experiencing trauma. So I don't think there's ever a finish line, and I think we need to commit to being on a path. So I appreciate you naming that.
Yeah, completely. And agree so wholeheartedly that this is a path. Not always a straight one. Sometimes it's curving around and has hills and valleys and rocks and stumbling that we will stumble on. And that's part of the path.
Agreed.
All right. So let's talk for just a moment. Your thoughts on mindfulness teacher training and the need for greater awareness of trauma in the setting of mindfulness-based interventions. The program that you and Willoughby and Jared will be doing addresses that, but I just want to hear your own thoughts about how it's important that teacher training is maybe more robust than a short program and you're off to the races. I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. And I imagine you might have some stories here too, which I'd invite you to throw in of, I think well, I'll back up for a second. And this is where I agree with folks who are my argument that we're inside a social context often, of which capitalism is the kind of the water that we're swimming in. And so by its nature, mindfulness practices and interventions keep getting reduced down to 1 day, 2 day courses or online programs. No bad on that, except that the promises that are made are often very strong. And I think it can create, there's a number of us, I would include Center for Mindfulness, you, other folks working at the intersections that you are, of really fighting for depth and fighting for path. And the metaphor that's been most helpful for me that someone said is really around martial arts, is that you wouldn't take a weekend workshop on karate or a different martial art or meditation and then go and teach it. You wouldn't even train for a year and then go and teach it. And yet it can be tempting because of a certain narrative, I think, out there to think that, well, mindfulness reduces stress. It's so basic. I'll just give people the instruction. So I think, yeah, that's part of what I'm wanting to do with the book, is to say, hey, mindfulness communities training teachers, my opinion, I think it'd be useful for folks to have some competence around trauma. And I'm not claiming myself as to be an expert inside of mindfulness. I'm not a mindfulness teacher. And I would need to go through, to me, a number of years of mindfulness training to ever step out and offer it. So it's a request of us to just keep humbling ourselves in the face of 2,600-year-old tradition inside of Buddhism, particularly, and really just get humble. That we need to be very careful. I don't want to be not too careful, but we want to be cognizant of the powers of practice and what we're offering to folks. Do you want to say, I'm sure, because you're in community, do you want to share any stories you have about ways that you're seeing this show up?
Yeah, as you and I have talked about before, and I've mentioned, I think, a few times through various conversations online, that what I often see is a couple of things. One is perhaps a bit of a misperception about what science is and what its current state is. A gentleman reached out to me within the past few months, and what I saw on this individual's website was the word proven, in reference in the context of science, is proven mindfulness does X, Y, Z. And of course, that set off some red flags for me as a science-minded skeptic, not a deniist, a skeptic. How do you know this? And science is tentative, it's provisional, and our understanding changes and grows as we learn more. And certainly in mindfulness, it's early on in our scientific study of what's happening when certain practices are. And as you mentioned, the Mind the Hype paper, one of the things that Wilby and the other authors stressed in our reference, the interview with Nicholas Van Dam, lead author on that paper, is that mindfulness has many definitions. And it doesn't mean there are no definitions. It means there are many different ones, and we need to understand the context. And the word proven is always a red flag, because it's just not how science operates. It's our best way of learning what we can about the natural world. Other things that I have seen are ways in which some people who are outstanding teachers, maybe outstanding because of a natural talent, gift that they have for connecting with others, from a long-term practice that was not necessarily in a secular mindfulness context, and outstanding training programs, which certainly do exist. There's a tremendous variety in not only individuals and the practice they have, but the programs themselves. There's currently, as of this recording, not an equivalency between one program and another that one might find in teacher training programs. So some that have many, many hours, they're perhaps in at least that one criteria, the amount of time, the contact hours with a teacher are much less than some others. And it may be that some people going through a program with fewer hours are nonetheless great teachers and become that. That's certainly not meant to deny that at all. And also, there's at least in this one aspect of training programs, hours with their teacher, it's much less. And for me, I can only see that as looking back on all of the things I have learned in my own teacher training pathway and continue to learn and learn most from the participants. Getting out of my own way is something that is constantly refreshed in my own learnings. And that's been supported tremendously by continued practice and training. And that's putting in the time. And your metaphor, I think, is very good. Another that has shown up many times is exercise. I wouldn't go to the gym and do 5 sit-ups and I'm done. And now I'm a teacher of physical education. It's not so. I need more than that. And it doesn't mean that I might not be in great condition anyway, aside from those 5 sit-ups. But there's more to it than that. And just learning about others is a huge aspect of it for me.
Agreed. And one thing I want to share, especially because I think of the folks who listen to your podcast, or what I imagine the audience that you might have, is the deep, deep respect I have for folks who are doing this research, of the guests you've had on. I mean, one thing I've learned from Willoughby Britton and Jared Lindahl is I see them, they work so hard on one sentence that will be published in an academic press. I mean, they work their butts off to have it referenced and to have those references be grounded. And it gives me just such deep respect for people who are not just on a whim saying, oh, let me just make this claim. Like, no, we're going to ground this claim and do the best we can. And again, not, as you're saying, not as a denialist. Actually, that word I had not heard, but I love it. Denialist, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And yet, as someone who's just saying, no, let's just keep pursuing this path and be more complex and rigorous, as complex and rigorous as we can about it. So I love that you brought that up.
So one other thing that I do want to ask you about that was also a very wonderful thing to see in this book is around your own personal commitment to social change. And the way that's showing up for folks who are listening, David is donating 60% of his proceeds of this book to a few different socially active organizations. I'm wondering if you might say a little bit about them and what led you to make this decision.
Yeah, thanks for asking about it. It's true. I'm doing that. 60% of the book is going to be donated. I had to kind of take a big breath of air when that went to press, but it's happening and I feel great about it. And I can say a couple of reasons behind it. As I said at the beginning, there's this core argument to me that if anyone is saying I'm a trauma-informed practitioner, that there's a responsibility inside of both doing individual work, but also systemic work, really, that we're trying to get to the root of the problem, which to me aligns with a lot of contemplative practices. Like, let's get to the roots of it. Let's not just trim the leaves. And I've had a number of mentors in my life who said, well, really, really, what is this going to do? What will this book make different? And I think a big contribution is actually shifting resource and money towards organizations who are doing work around trauma. I'll say a little bit about the 3 organizations I chose. One is a group called Generative Somatics, which is a group I train with. And it's a group that's doing embodied leadership work with people who are in social justice movements. And so that's really supporting them to be able to keep doing the frontline work that they're doing. Second is Black Lives Matter, as someone who's been really trying to learn more about my own privilege and own whiteness, and learning over the last 5 years the power of Black-led organizing in the US and how that can shape social change, just wanted to get behind Black Lives Matter. They also have a healing justice program, which is really doing work around trauma inside of communities around the country. And so that's an organization I wanted to fund. And the final one is a group called the Segurite Land Trust, which is a group of people in the Bay Return of Ohlone territory land back to the Ohlone tribe. And that was in part a recognition of the fact that I wrote this in San Francisco in the Bay Area. And it's like a form of reparations, just an acknowledgement and a bow to the fact that it's not my land, that I was a colonial settler. on this land and wanting to give back. So that's for me. That's what's worked for me. And that's felt really good. And the fact that as a white man, I'm fine. Like I'm fine in this culture. I'm privileged in a lot of different ways. And wanting to make sure that the money and the power that I'm receiving through the access I have is also going to lift up the voices of folks who are really doing frontline work around shifting conditions that perpetuate trauma. So I appreciate you asking about that.
Yeah, glad to. So is there anything else you can think of that you'd like to share with the listeners or potential readers of the book?
Yeah, there's one more thing that we didn't get to touch on, which is I'd like to just say briefly about ways that I understand some of the benefits of mindfulness for trauma survivors. I'll just cover this a minute, and for readers to know there's a chapter that's a deeper dive into this, but I really want to stress, because people can tend to hold on to, oh, it's not helpful for trauma survivors. Well, actually it can be. And the primary way that I understand this to work, and again, there's not a lot of empirical research, I wish that would be done, is around the way that mindfulness supports self-regulation. For trauma survivors, self-regulation is often thrown into chaos. It's really hard to control one's mind, physical sensations. And so there's neuroscience research which suggests, and we could link this, around mindfulness interventions help with attention regulation, body awareness, emotion regulation. And these are all things that really support trauma survivors. So in the right context, with the right supports in place, again, that's that caveat. Mindfulness, the skill of mindfulness is really powerful. The practice of mindfulness meditation, meaning how we cultivate that skill, that's often where people can run themselves into problems. But actually having mindfulness as a power of mind is a very, very powerful skill that survivors can use. And we can talk more about that another time if you want.
Thank you. Well, our guest today, David Treleaven, you can find out more about David's work on his website, which is linked to the episode page for this episode, along with the book we've been talking about, and a few other links that are helpful about things we referred to today. David, thank you so much for being here. Wonderful to see you and speak with you again.
Thanks, Ted. You too. Thanks for all your work.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.